When Prince William stood before the royal council and uttered 12 words, my father chose George to carry Diana's legacy. In secret, the room fell into an icy silence. What followed was a cascading unraveling of lies, loyalty, and legacy that would shake the monarchy to its foundations. This wasn't just about succession, it was about memory, betrayal, and the weaponization of a mother's enduring spirit. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room had been sealed, phones confiscated, windows blacked out. Only the most senior members of the royal council were present. No press, no aides, not even Catherine. Just blood, power, and the shadow of a queen long gone. When William spoke, there was no hesitation, just quiet devastation behind his eyes. Those 12 words weren't merely a confession, they were an ignition. The silence that followed was broken only by the scratch of a pen recording official minutes, which would be immediately redacted and sealed. Council members glanced at one another, but no one dared speak. They all knew what it meant. This was no ceremonial announcement, it was the dislodging of a pillar the monarchy had hidden behind for decades. Someone asked if a copy of the decree existed, and William nodded toward the corner, where a royal messenger stood with a locked satchel, marked with the wax insignia of Balmoral's East Wing archives. The letter was rumoured to have been written by Charles years prior during a time of visible illness, just as public confidence in the monarchy wavered. Inside the sealed Balmoral document, it was believed, lay the blueprint for the future, not in line with tradition, but rooted in one haunting name, Diana. But what startled the council most wasn't the mention of legacy. It was that this legacy was not abstract, not spiritual, not ceremonial. It had been designed as a living transfer, a functional inheritance, one meant to be passed down to a child untouched by scandal, a soul untainted by the wars of the older generation. That child was George. Hints of George's secret education began surfacing in hushed tones. Aides whispered of retired tutors reappearing at Kensington under the guise of heritage instruction. A former communications officer, once aligned with Diana's humanitarian ventures, had been spotted entering side entrances. It became clear this was not just grooming for kingship. This was the transference of ethos, mission, voice. George was not being prepared to rule. He was being sculpted to carry a flame, to become a mirror to a woman he had never met, but whose impact never left his family's wounds. The private instruction was not recent. It had begun years ago, quietly and methodically. But perhaps the most chilling absence that night was that of Queen Camilla. Not once did she appear during the entire session, nor was her name mentioned in any capacity. Some council members speculated she had been purposefully excluded. Others whispered that she already knew and had chosen to stay away in protest. Whatever the truth, her silence roared through the palace halls. If the king's consort had been bypassed in a matter of dynastic legacy, then the real question emerged: who else had been kept in the dark? Or worse, who had known and stayed silent, waiting for this exact moment to watch everything collapse, but to understand how such a revelation was possible? We must first revisit the very moment King Charles made the impossible decision alone, haunted and bound by a promise whispered at Diana's grave. Few knew that Charles returned to Diana's burial site at Althorpe without cameras, without fanfare, just months after her death. But what he whispered there, kneeling before her grave in the fog of guilt, would eventually spark the most unexpected dynastic twist of our time. Was it grief or calculation? It was a moonless night when Charles's unmarked car pulled up beside the quiet lake on the Spencer estate. There were no royal guards, no pageantry. Only one aide, sworn to silence, stood at a respectful distance, while the Prince of Wales, still years from his ascension, walked alone to the place where his former wife had been laid to rest. In the hush of that moment, with nothing but the breeze in the reeds and the weight of decisions that could never be undone, Charles knelt and stayed there for what one witness said was nearly an hour. What he said was barely audible, but what he left behind would become the foundation of a legacy reshaped in shadows. Beneath the earth, above the grave, he placed a handwritten note in a sealed envelope, its content never publicly disclosed, but later recovered by a loyal groundskeeper, who would recall only the first line he dared to read, "The crown will know her still." That single phrase would echo years later within the highest ranks of royal decision-making. But back then, it was nothing more than a secret grief, tethered to a man too proud to weep in public and too haunted to let go. The note disappeared into a royal archive, classified under restricted entry. But the intent had already germinated. Diana's legacy would not be interred with her. It would be revived, redefined, and, most of all, reassigned. For the first time, the idea of legacy within the monarchy was no longer symbolic. It was seen as something transferable, almost constitutional. Not merely about memory or mourning, but about real, active purpose, something to be held, guarded, passed down. A lineage of principle, of heart, and above all, of disruption. This notion would be catalogued in a cryptic, rarely referenced entry within Charles's travel records, simply titled, "Stagfall Visit to Appendix Windsor 4. For years that phrase would remain a mystery, locked behind codes used only in state-level succession documents. But within the palace, it triggered hushed meetings and forbidden conversations. Weeks after the Stagfall visit, Princess Anne and Prince Edward were summoned to a private chamber within the Sandringham estate. Were no aides present, no recordings. But sources close to the siblings claimed they emerged visibly altered, silent, firm, and more protective than ever of Prince George's private life. Insiders now believe this was the first invocation of Protocol Clarion, a monarchic contingency plan designed not for political emergency, but for cultural preservation. And its focal point was neither Charles nor William. It was a child still too young to understand what he had inherited. The decision had already been made. George would not merely be raised as a future king, he would be trained covertly and meticulously as the torchbearer of a legacy too volatile for tradition and too powerful for silence. From that night onward, Charles's behavior shifted, and his plans for George quietly began to take shape behind the palace walls. While the public saw a smiling child in ceremonial garb, behind closed doors, Prince George was being mentored by figures long believed retired or exiled, those who had once served Diana herself. What was being passed to him wasn't just history, it was strategy. The reintegration of these forgotten figures was not announced, not recorded, and certainly not authorized by any traditional body of royal governance. Yet, one by one, names once whispered in proximity to Diana's private world began reappearing on confidential visitor logs. No titles, no job roles, only initials and arrival times inked in red. Among them were former speechwriters, aides in her overseas missions, and even an etiquette advisor who had vanished after Diana's funeral, allegedly dismissed by Charles himself. Together, they would become known only within the palace as the Keepers of Appendix Windsor 4, a clandestine assembly charged with a single, seismic mission to prepare the boy not merely as a monarch, but as a vessel for the legacy Diana was never allowed to complete. This was Ent education. It was indoctrination of empathy, defiance, and memory. George was tutored in the resilience of constitutional compromise, taught how to interpret silence in crowded rooms, and shown the mechanics of shaping public perception without manipulation. In place of mathematics, he studied the 1995 Panorama interview line by line. Instead of simple geography, he was drilled in the optics of humanitarian outreach and global inequality. One of the keepers noted in a private log, he asked about her tears today. Not just why she cried, but who watched and didn't stop her. That entry, buried deep in palace records, would later be flagged in a report prepared for the Royal Media Secretariat as concerning in its depth and its clarity. What remains most startling, even now, is that William and Catherine knew. They were not simply aware of the sessions, they had been instructed by sealed royal writ not to interfere. The document, marked under Clarion Discretion Tier 3, bound them with one line: "This legacy shall be passed unbroken. The parents are not the keepers." Imagine the anguish of watching your child absorb the pain, courage, and defiance of a woman they never met, knowing full well it was shaping a future you were no longer scripting. William once confided to a close aide, "He's being built to echo her. I can only hope he won't inherit her loneliness too." And through it all, Charles remained distant but not absent. He sent letters each hand-delivered, each ending with the same signature phrase, "In her spirit, not mine." The contents of those letters were never disclosed, but one reportedly included a quote Diana had once written in her personal journal: "The greatest legacy is to live free in the hearts of those you've touched." George, though just a boy, was being asked to carry that legacy not as a memory but as a mantle. But even as George was shap, Ed in silence, Diana's legacy burned outside the palace, especially in the one place the monarchy could never fully control: public memory. Diana never needed a crown to become a queen in the hearts of millions. Her legacy lived in candlelight vigils, charity murals, and the words of mothers across Britain. And it is this unstoppable force of public emotion that Charles feared and ultimately tried to control through George. For decades after her passing, Diana's image not only endured, it intensified. Far beyond the bounds of the palace gates, she became a symbol not of royalty, but of resistance to it. From primary school classrooms to hospital corridors, her name was whispered as a symbol of compassion, rebellion, and love, unfiltered by protocol. The monarchy, meanwhile, struggled to contain her growing mythos. Clarence House commissioned quiet polling over several years, and the results were damning. The public's identification with Diana was only growing, while trust in Camilla was eroding, especially among younger generations. Even as the new queen consort stepped into her public duties, she was consistently outshone by a woman no longer alive. It was a legacy the institution could not bury, no matter how carefully they rewrote the narrative. Inside the palace, William carried the weight of this reality. Though outwardly dutiful, he found subtle ways to honor his mother through charity selections, speech quotes, and unannounced visits to causes Diana once championed. But these gestures caused friction with Charles, who viewed them as quiet challenges to the crown's unity. What the king couldn't predict was that George had already inherited this silent defiance. Without permission, the young prince reportedly shared one of Diana's old humanitarian letters during a classroom discussion on world hunger. A teacher, stunned by its personal nature, discreetly flagged the incident. It caused a brief internal stir, but the matter was hushed. Still, the message was clear. The legacy Charles once tried to contain was now escaping through the very air he had chosen to control it. Efforts to dilute Diana's influence were not limited to silence. Palace historians were instructed to revise and streamline old patronage lists, many of which once bore Diana's name. Several public-facing web pages were updated, erasing her early work from official documentation. The goal was subtle erasure, not attack. But within the palace, not everyone complied. Prince Edward, known for his quiet integrity, refused a direct order to remove a Diana portrait from a royal hallway in Windsor. "History doesn't forget," he reportedly told a junior aide. That act of stillness became a silent rebellion, a quiet nod to the truth no edit could erase. It was becoming clear that no amount of controlled grooming or sanitized history could tame the emotional wildfire Diana had left behind. Charles had tried to engineer George's future as a way of neutralizing the past. But that past had grown larger than the palace, more enduring than any decree. The people had chosen their queen, and the monarchy, despite its power, was slowly bending beneath the weight of a legacy it neither understood nor deserved to possess. But even the most calculated legacy maneuvering could not prevent what happened next, when a sealed document surfaced and Catherine herself broke rank to protect it. The envelope was unmarked except for an insignia no one recognized until Princess Catherine opened it and gasped. What lay inside was not just a letter from Charles, it was a blueprint of succession, sealed with Diana's sapphire ring. And its instructions would pit loyalty against blood. It began with a simple moment of nostalgia. Catherine, searching through an old jewelry case in the Windsor East Wing, stumbled upon a velvet pouch she didn't remember storing. Inside it was something heavier than any heirloom, an envelope so pristine, so deliberately tucked away, it felt almost sacred. Etched on its flap was a silver insignia resembling a twisted crown wrapped in ivy, an emblem she would later learn belonged to a secret royal directive buried deep within the unseen strata of palace law, Appendix Windsor 4. Hands trembling, she opened it. The air thickened. And as her eyes traced the letter's contents, everything shifted. In it, Charles detailed what could only be described as a silent coronation, not of kingship, but of legacy. He named Prince George as the official legacy holder of Diana. No ceremonial role, no traditional title, just 6 devastating words: he will carry what she began. Attached was an aged photograph of Diana with a young William, creased but carefully preserved. Scribbled on its back were the words, "For the heir's heir." It was more than a message. It was a prophecy, passed down not through bloodlines but belief. The document was countersigned and stamped under Clarion Tier 3, a classification Catherine had only heard once in whispers following the Queen's death, when emergency roles were quietly reassigned. The implication was clear: this wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. Diana's legacy, once a ghost haunting the monarchy, was now formally embedded within its future blueprint. And George, still just a boy, was its carrier. Catherine froze. The instinct to protect her son clashed with the fear of defying a monarch's final decree. She paced for hours, reading and rereading, hoping it would dissolve into something less dangerous. But each line only hardened the truth. This wasn't about trust, it was about inheritance. And if this envelope ever reached the wrong hands, George would be a target not just of scrutiny, but of power. Still, secrets Ike, this don't stay hidden for long. A single misstep, a curious aid, an unlocked drawer, a hint of panic in Catherine's voice was all it took. Word of a coded royal document involving Diana leaked into internal corridors. Meetings were called, doors slammed, phones confiscated. Camilla, already uneasy with the growing public comparisons between herself and Diana, sensed something had changed. Her paranoia escalated. She demanded access to any classified material bearing Diana's name, only to be told, quietly but firmly, that the matter was above her clearance. That denial only deepened her suspicion. Whispers circulated that she had requested surveillance on George's schedule and unauthorized reviews of William and Catherine's communications measures, typically reserved for national threats, not family. Behind the scenes, the palace was cracking under the pressure of a truth that had always been too big to suppress. And amid the rising tension, Catherine, still silent, still torn, placed the envelope in a second safe, this time under her own private security code. But she knew the containment wouldn't hold. The truth had been touched. It was breathing now, and its impact had begun rippling through the walls of Buckingham and beyond. Something irreversible had been set in motion. A child, a legacy, a mother's ghost, all colliding inside a velvet envelope. As the palace tightened its grip on information, one royal couldn't be silenced, and that's when William made his most dangerous move yet. In a voice thick with emotion, William's words echoed in a recording never meant for the public. He deserves to know. It was never mine to carry. That audio, sent to only 4 royal aides, would soon trigger the most destabilizing leak in recent monarchy history. It was supposed to be a moment of private reckoning, a raw, unfiltered confession meant only for a handful of senior advi. Soars. William had reached his limit, the quiet burden that had followed him since Diana's passing, the expectations of inheritance, the invisible duty to embody a legacy that was never his. It had all culminated in that single recording. He spoke not as a prince, not as an heir, but as a father. My son is growing into a role I never asked for, trained for a crown he may not even wear, but you knew that already, he said. And still, you let it happen. The file was encrypted and sent under a non-classified label to 4 names: Lord Halbridge, Lady Mariston, Sir Keane, and Countess Ridley, all long trusted, all sworn to silence. But silence doesn't last in a house built on secrets. Princess Anne was the first to respond. Her message, brief and direct, cut deeper than expected. We're beyond precedent now. She had seen enough power struggles, enough protocol revisions to know that this wasn't about roles anymore. It was about rupture. But the chain broke when one of the 4, still unnamed, still protected by royal anonymity, forwarded the audio to a journalist who had long maintained ties to palace staff. By the time the file was flagged by internal monitors, it had already been copied, transcribed, and quietly confirmed as authentic. The royal office initiated an emergency lockdown. Devices were confiscated. Communications were scrubbed. But it was too late. Whispers of the phrase "it was never mine to carry" began appearing across digital tabloids and coded Twitter accounts, triggering a storm of speculation about what William had truly meant. In the midst of containment efforts, William confronted his father for the first time since Catherine discovered the envelope. The conversation, described by one witness as volcanic, ended with William slamming the door to the private council room. He accused Charles of shaping a destiny for George without consent, of weaponizing Diana's memory to compensate for public sympathy he had never earned. Charles, cornered and silent, reportedly offered no defense, only the words, "It was always going to fall to someone." Hours later, Camilla approached William in the royal gardens. Her voice was low, biting. She accused him of betrayal, of destabilizing the crown at a moment when continuity was critical. "You've cracked the spine of a story we cannot afford to rewrite," she warned. William's reply was chilling. "Then maybe it's time the truth writes itself." The public, always hungry for fragments of royal vulnerability, seized the moment. Diana's true heir? Read the headline of a Sunday paper. Photos of George were reanalyzed with prophetic fervor. Archived videos of Diana holding William were re-edited to include footage of George's latest charity visits. The internet did what the palace feared most. It connected the dots, filled in the gaps, and built a narrative of inheritance that no royal decree could now reverse. But just as the media storm began to spiral, a stunning act of symbolism by young George would ignite global attention. At a youth charity gala, Prince George approached the podium, opened his speech, and quietly placed Diana's iconic photo beside him. What followed was a message of hope, humanity, and an unmistakable signal to the nation. Diana's voice lives on through him. No one expected what came next. The speech had been vetted, rehearsed, softened for his age and position. But George, barely into his teens, took a step outside the script and straight into history. Before he uttered a single word, he reached into his blazer pocket and gently placed a framed black and white photo of his grandmother on the podium. The image, once used in Diana's 1997 charity tour through Angola, had become a global emblem of fearless compassion. And now it stood beside her grandson as he addressed. Said the crowd not as a prince, but as a messenger. What he said was simple. "She once told the world that kindness is a crown anyone can wear." I think that's still true. There was no pretense, no politics, just raw legacy delivered with innocence but received with thunder. The reaction was instant and overwhelming. Within minutes, social media erupted. The hashtag Air of Hope dominated global trends for 72 straight hours. News anchors paused programming to analyze the symbolism. Archival footage of Diana's speeches flooded the airwaves, juxtaposed with George's words. What had begun as a youth charity dinner suddenly transformed into a royal reckoning. For many, this wasn't just a touching tribute, it was the embodiment of a torch passed. A quiet, undeniable claim that Diana's legacy had found its next vessel. Cake stage, Catherine could be seen turning her face away, dabbing at her eyes with the corner of her hand. She had fought so long to shield her son from the burden of the legacy, only to see him step into it by choice. The palace staff, security detail, even seasoned royal press were caught off guard. And yet no one moved to stop him. For once, protocol didn't matter. The room was still. The message had landed, and somewhere deep within Windsor, King Charles watched the entire moment unfold alone from his study. Those who later entered the room claimed he sat in silence for nearly an hour. When he finally spoke, it was only 3 words. "He's ready now, bar tea." Aftermath within the palace was less composed. Camilla, already retreating from public events in recent weeks, cancelled 3 upcoming appearances without explanation. Her absence was not publicly addressed, but insiders say she cited ill health and private concerns. Few questioned it, but many understood the timing. A new wave of calls surged across the UK and Commonwealth to formally integrate Diana's legacy into royal institutions. One petition demanding the renaming of a major youth initiative in Diana's honour gained over 1 million signatures in days. Parliamentarians were even rumored to be drafting a proposal to recognize Diana with a permanent ceremonial day, something no consort in history had ever received. In the eyes of the people, the crown had been tilted, not toppled, not disgraced, but shifted. It was no longer just about titles or lineage. It was about meaning, and in that meaning George had found his place not as the next king, perhaps, but as the next voice. One born of loss, sculpted by silence, and destined for something far greater than gold or pageantry. As the crown stood at a crossroads between memory and monarchy, a final revelation would solidify George's new role and Diana's undying influence. Hidden in the annex of Charles's private will was a single paragraph never reviewed by legal advisors, one that invoked her spirit, her cause, her son's son. It granted not a title, but a purpose. George would one day reign not only with power, but with Diana's legacy in his hands. It was only uncovered by accident. While conducting a routine review of estate logistics following Charles's worsening health, a junior member of the Crown's legal affairs team noticed a sealed subsection marked Clause Obsidian. Tucked at the very end of an otherwise conventional royal testament, it bore a security seal not used since the aftermath of Queen Elizabeth II's passing. Once decrypted and read, the room reportedly fell silent. In crisp, unmistakable handwriting, Charles had embedded a revelation so disruptive, it wasn't clear whether it held legal weight or spiritual intention. It wasn't a change to succession. It wasn't an assignment of assets. It was something far more profound, a decree of symbolic inheritance that named Prince George not as sovereign, in waiting, but as the guardian of her grace. And in that phrase, 3 generations of fractured loyalty were suddenly fused. What sent tremors through the royal legal department was the language itself. The phrasing was eerily reflective of Diana's personal writings, particularly her final letters to friends before her death, several of which included the now famous line, "If my boys can love freely, then I will have won." Charles's use of her son's son was no accident. It was a literary echo, a deliberate linguistic bridge between a woman he had once silenced and a boy he had chosen to speak in her place. The codicil's lack of precedent only deepened its weight. There was no category for it in the Sovereign Instruction Registry. It wasn't a command. It was a confession wrapped in a commission. Confusion turned to astonishment when Charles's signature was confirmed. He had signed the document not as His Majesty but simply C. And beneath that, the handwritten line, "He will not wear her crown, but he will carry her cause." For a monarch who had spent decades maintaining composure, this was a stunning act of emotional exposure. Within days, an internal motion was proposed to enshrine George in a newly defined ceremonial role, crown heir of legacy. The move was met with quiet resistance from certain factions, particularly those aligned with Camilla. But when invitations for the upcoming state charter review were circulated, her name was conspicuously absent. No explanation followed. None was needed. A line had been drawn. As public calls for clarity grew louder, the palace issued a vague statement confirming a new ceremonial reflection of heritage and hope would be unveiled in the coming months. But behind the curtain, the true decision had already been made. George's path would no longer be dictated solely by crown or constitution, but by legacy, by a missio that transcended rule, and by a spirit that refused to die, even when every force in the kingdom tried to bury it. But the story doesn't end with a title, it lives on in how a mother's voice continues through a boy who never met her, yet carries her name like a flame. He never asked for the legacy. He never met the woman he now symbolizes. But Prince George is already rewriting what royalty means, not with decrees, but with compassion. In a palace built on power, he's becoming something far more enduring, a bridge between Diana's broken past and the monarchy's uncertain future. In the quiet corridors of Windsor, change rarely announces itself with thunder. It begins instead with soft defiance. With a young boy asking deeper questions, staying longer at charity visits and slipping away from rehearsed lines to speak from the heart. Prince George, once the symbol of polished succession, has evolved into something far less scripted and far more human. His involvement in youth mental health initiatives has grown beyond mere patronage. Staff now note his insistence on meeting the children before press arrives. listening to their stories, asking how they're truly feeling. One advisor recalled George cancelling a scheduled royal photo opportunity, saying, "They need time, not cameras." That wasn't protocol. That was personal, and it marked a quiet revolution in how the crown shows its care. Catherine and William, once cautious of overexposing their son, have shifted. Their approach is no longer about preservation of image, but amplification of authenticity. They've stripped down events, removed ceremonial layers, and placed substance above tradition. Diana's blueprint, raw, empathetic, radically honest, is now unmistakable in their day-to-day engagements. And in Windsor, something unthinkable a decade ago has become reality. A tribute room, bathed in silence, dedicated solely to Diana. No crown, no portrait alongside other monarchs, just her letters, her causes, and the recordings of her voice. George visits often. He stays longer than anyone. It was in that room that staff discovered he had begun writing. A notebook, thick with unlined pages, appeared one morning on the windowsill. The first page, scrawled in neat, careful handwriting, bore the title, Her Echo. No one reads it without permission. But the message is clear. George isn't just learning legacy, he's preserving it. And in the absence of his grandmother, he is building a new foundation for what monarchy might mean, one rooted not in authority, but in remembrance. Meanwhile, Charles's health continues to fade quietly from public view. His weekly briefings, once limited to seasoned advisors, now include George, who listens more than he speaks, who watches closely, and who seems to understand the weight passing silently across generations. Those inside the family note that Charles, in his final seasons of rule, speaks less of succession and more of stewardship. He no longer asks if George will be king. He asks only if George will endure. And that may be the most honest passing of power the crown has ever seen. In a recent private note, William is said to have written to his senior aides, "He rise what she gave me and more." It wasn't a proclamation. It was a quiet confirmation of a journey still unfolding. Because while crowns can be removed, while titles can be lost, legacy lives in whispers, in ink, in choice. And George, the boy who never met Diana, may yet become the only royal capable of completing what she began. And so the legacy lives on not in marble nor crown, but in the quiet courage of a boy chosen to carry the flame of a queen never crowned. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.